in today's live, I'm going to kick us off with 5 types of candle blemishes. The first type I'm going to cover are wet spots. Wet spots, they look like the candle is wet. I'm going to see if I can't get this to show up pretty well here. But it looks like there's moisture in there. I mean, that's kind of the appearance. It's not actually moisture. What's actually going on there is that the wax is not adhering to the wall directly. And some is, some isn't. The fact that some is and some isn't is why it looks kind of wet. If it was all the same, you probably wouldn't notice it as much. But you can see some of those streaks where it is a little bit different. So what causes this? Well, it can happen with any wax. It can happen with soy wax. It can happen with paraffin wax. It can happen with beeswax. Any wax. No waxes are excluded, but it is a property of the wax. More specifically, it's the relationship between the wax type and the jar or the vessel that it's in. Obviously, you wouldn't have wet spots if you were pouring a mold or even in maybe not so much in a wax melt. But what's happening is, like, if you think about wax, it expands as it heats up and it contracts as it cools down, and that contraction moves it away from the vessel. And moving it away, in fact, actually, will pull it from the walls. It'll pull it away from the walls. And one of the other blemishes we'll talk about later, it's kind of the same behavior that we have to fight to avoid that one too. But the manufacturers are privy to this. They know what's going on, and so they understand that they need to build a wax that can resist this natural action of wax. We can't stop wax from expanding as it heats up and contracting as it cools down. That's the nature of the wax. So the manufacturers are cheeky and they create these additives and they do this chemistry and stuff. It's way beyond me, but it helps it adhere to the wall. So you'll see waxes that are called out. These are for container candles, and you'll see other waxes that are not made for container candles. They're made for other applications, or they're not called out for container candles. And the properties of those waxes are a lot better at adhering to the container wall. So waxes like Nature Wax C3 or 464, the two probably most popular ones, at least where I'm at, those are designed to be in containers. They're designed to resist that pull away effect from the wax contracting. Now, is it perfect? Absolutely not. This was made with, oops, I've been holding the wrong candle. This was made with pure C3, just C3 soy wax. You can see it's still pulled away. So what else is happening there? Well, anytime the temperature changes, wax potentially changes its size, or it feels a force to do so. The biggest event in a candle's life is when we pour it into that container. At that moment in time, it's cooling a pretty dramatic amount. Like the whole thing, most of the time, the whole thing is liquid and it's turning into a solid. So there's a lot of contraction that happens there. That's the big one. Then you'll see wet spots develop at that point. But the other big ones are the moments after the candle's been poured where just the room temp changes, or the environment it's in is different, or transport somewhere. Like those are all little micro events that can affect the temperature of the wax. And at that point, wet spots can form as well. You may pour a candle, not see a single wet spot, but over time it may develop that simply because of that same behavior. That adhesion finally gives out, or enough temperature changes where it's a problem, and that's the whole thing there. So what can we do about it? That's the second part of this. Well, with wet spots, it's good to clean your containers before you pour your wax. Now this is like dish soap and hot water, and make it perfectly dry, because that wax needs a good clean surface to adhere to. And if there's not a good clean area for it to adhere to in a glass or aluminum container, it's gonna risk pulling away from the jar. It kind of makes sense. So if you're like me and you reuse a lot of jars, you tend to have a little bit more wet spots in your testing collection, I'll call it, because I don't super clean these things. I kind of just generally get them out of the way. But the good news is with wet spots, it's not actually going to impact your performance. It's completely cosmetic. And the truth is, there's a lot of people out there that worry about these wet spots. Oh my gosh, they're going to look at my candle, they're going to hate it, they're going to see these wet spots, but the truth is, because it's cosmetic, no big deal. Most people don't even know what it is. Most people don't even recognize it. I'm talking about people who consume candles. Candle makers get up in a tizzy, including myself at times. I'm like, this is not what I had planned. But it's just cosmetic, so there's no risk there. The other things you can do is pour your wax at a cooler temperature. Now why does this matter? When the wax enters that jar, and the wax is at a cool temperature, it doesn't have to cool as much to get to the final form. If it only has to cool 20 degrees versus 80 degrees, that's a pretty big difference. And so you'll see that pouring at a cooler temperature helps. Like we said, helps. It's not going to prevent it entirely. The passing of time, you may end up seeing it again. The other thing you can do if you're a candle maker and you're holding onto these things for a while is store them in an area that you don't think is going to fluctuate in temperature. Now, I don't think this is a great piece of advice because most people aren't transporting them from a hot garage back inside down to the basement. Like, most of that is not happening. But if you happen to have a weird setup, or maybe you're doing it in your kitchen and moving it somewhere else, try to keep the temperature fluctuations to just normal indoor stuff. It's not going to be perfect. Number 2 blemish on candles is these bumpy tops. Now, we've all struggled with them. They just happen, right? Sometimes you do everything perfect. I saw a picture on Facebook yesterday of side by side. They're like, I poured same batch, same container, same jar, same wick. This one is perfect. This one looks horrible. This one looks like golf balls or some horrible thing went wrong with it. What happened? Well, the truth is sometimes it does just happen. And it happens because of soy wax, of polymorphism. Now, this isn't just soy wax, but soy wax is the most popular one, the one that we probably all talked about the most. But that polymorphic nature means that the wax under the covers is really just a bunch of crystals that all kind of go together, and it melts down to a liquid, and then it rehardens into crystals of different random sizes, and all of that happens. It's called that polymorphism. Well, these different sized crystals, sometimes they don't agree with each other, and they're going to try to organize themselves best as possible. And sometimes their vision of what's good is different than our vision of what's good. These crystals, they don't actually have a brain, not that you thought they did. But bumpy tops. Now, I've poured a few candles in my life, and I would say at this point, when I'm just randomly doing stuff, because I do a lot of random testing, like not product line stuff, just seeing what happens. Bumpy tops happen a little more often than I wish they did, but they're typically not a big deal. But what you can do if you struggle with bumpy tops, or you've got one, or maybe you're putting out a product line, you got to get these out the door, but 2 of them look horrible, and most of us know this, but like take a heat gun and just very barely melt the very top of that, 1/8 of an inch, probably less, just enough to create a sheen there, and that'll make it look smooth. Now, is smooth a little bit of a farce? Sometimes after you burn your candle, it ends up looking bumpy, like you're halfway down the candle, normal soy wax candle, and just looks bumpy after it cools, and that's okay too. So, but the biggest recommendation I have for fighting against bumpy tops is make sure you heat your wax to 185. Why is 185 Celsius, 185 Fahrenheit? Why is that important? Because that's the temperature where, for the most part, we found as a candle making community that soy wax is going to break down to its smallest size so that the crystals all kind of cool together and are generally consistent with one another. The inconsistencies in those crystal sizes are what causes the bumpy top. So if the whole blend was created at too low of a temperature, we never melted it down, more than likely, if you fix the bumpy top and then you burn the candle, you may have another bumpy top. So, but another important part of that is fragrance oil has little to do with bumpy tops. Like that's a pretty big misnomer. I think I believe that at one point. It was like, oh, if I add fragrance oil, I get bumpy top. No, it's the soy wax. It's completely the wax. Nadine, what is too hot? Well, in the candle making world, I would say that with soy wax, the 4 laws of temperature management that I have for soy wax, 200 degrees, I try to not go above 200. So 185 to 200 is the sweet spot for where I personally heat my soy wax, add my fragrance oil. No matter what the candle is, no matter what I'm doing with it, no matter what the fragrance oil looks like, 185 to 200 Fahrenheit. I think that's 85 to 93 Celsius. Someone can check me on that. That's the sweet spot. So if you go up above it, don't freak out. Just like get it down, take it off the heat, whatever you got to do. Don't keep it up there for too long, because then you could scorch the wax. Then you'll see some discoloration. But for fighting the polymorphism, that 185 to 200, that's a good place to be. That's a great place to be. And it's not perfect. Like, soy wax is still going to misbehave, and that's why it's frustrating and rewarding at the same time when you're able to conquer it. But getting it to that area will help the crystals be consistent on the way down. My personal advice for fighting bumpy tops, if you're working through creating a design that is great, experiment with temperatures. Obviously, I always stick to that 185 to 200. That's a constant for me. But I'm talking about an airplane here. I'm talking about trying out different pour temperatures, trying out different rates of how fast you cool it. So, for instance, you heat it to 185, you add your fragrance, you stir it. How fast you cool it down, that period of time that passes, if you were to rapidly cool it down to, like, let's say you pour it at 130 or 140, if you made that take a short time, see what that looks like. If you made that take a long time, so maybe you put it in the oven or you hold it at temperature on your heating source for a while to really bring it down over a long period of time, all those things, those are things worth experimenting with, because I'd say it all the time. Even though we might be using the same supplies, even though we might be working with the same equipment, even though we may have a generally same environment, temperatures, humidity, all that, there are differences in our techniques and our processes. So when you hear someone say, yes, this always works for me, or no, never do that, I don't ever take that advice as pure gospel. The reason is because of those other nuances in how candles are made and how you and I work differently. That's why experimentation is so key, because let's say everything else is the same, you're going to see some differences. So that's why I say with Bumpy Tops, try out a variety of different, like, experiment. Like, that's an okay thing to do. And don't let anyone tell you how it ought to be or how it ought not to be. Because I've met people, or I've talked to people, some of you even, that have said this works, and others are like, this just doesn't work. So it's fun. I mean, that's kind of the fun of it. Third blemish, surface cracks. So this is where you've got, and I ironically don't have a good example. I've made plenty that do this, where you pour that candle, and you come back an hour later, and it's cooled, but there's this circular crack around the top, and it's just kind of pointing fun at you because it showed up even though you did everything right. Those are freaking annoying, but they happen because of the same thing from the very first thing we talked about, which is that wax heats up, expands as it heats up, and it contracts as it cools down. And that contraction starts to pull towards the walls because that's cooled first, but the middle cools last, so the middle's still trying to pull even though the outside is done, including the top. You'll see the top hardens first. Right underneath that, as it's cooling, that's still liquid. And it's cooling, and it's contracting, and it's pulling on the top. And if you're lucky and you have a blemish, it'll just be that little circular crack kind of goes around the wick. But that can present itself in 3 other ways too. Maybe you've seen it. It can pull down so much that it creates a crater literally on the surface of the top of the candle, or it can create a surface under the candle where it wasn't able to actually pull the top until it broke. It just pulled the top down, but underneath there's this air pocket that was created because the middle was cooling and contracting. So surface cracks are caused by just that nature of wax. So it has nothing to do with fragrance oil. It has very little to do with your process. It's just mostly wax cooling. That's what it does. That's what it's supposed to do. But there's 3 things that I recommend for dealing with surface cracks to prevent them, kind of to deal with them. Like, you can heat gun them. That'll make them go away. That's easy. Ideally, we wouldn't have to do anything. Like, we would just make candles. They'd be perfect. So these are my tips for that, for trying to get to the perfect stage right away. The first is, and I know I said experiment, but this is a good experiment to try, is with your wax, pour cooler. When you pour, try to get it as cloudy as possible. Try to get that blend to be as even of a temperature as possible, so that's lightly stirring all the way down. And then try to pour at as cool of a temperature as possible. The reason that can help is amount of contraction that has to happen when it only has to cool, let's call it 30 degrees versus if it had to cool 50 degrees Fahrenheit, is a pretty big difference. So that, that force, that amount of time that it's trying to yank on the top and yank on the sides, we can limit that by pouring at a cooler temperature. Now with soy wax, I've kind of had my best results pouring when it's pretty foggy, down to that 120, 130 range, like below the melt point. But that can help. That reduces the amount it has to contract. The other thing is, as it's cooling, like, even though we'd like to pour it and walk away, and sometimes you have to, but is to poke relief holes. So take a skewer or toothpick or whatever it is, and as it's cooling, maybe the top has cooled, just kind of poke a hole through the top, usually down by the wick, to try to give that melted wax room to fill those voids. Or instead of it's trying to pull on that, and you kind of give it this chance to reconcile itself. And if it can't, then the third tip is kind of related to that one. Leave a little wax from your batch and then go back and pour into those relief holes. Now, these are not perfect tips, right? You're fighting the nature of wax. You can ultimately just go through and heat gun everything, or maybe it looks good enough. Like most of the time, I bet most customers won't notice, but you get the occasional one. And then the third tip I have is just try to cure it in a warm environment. So that's kind of the opposite of making the wax have to cool less. That's making the jar a little bit warmer. So it keeps that gap of temperatures between the wax and the vessel a little less obvious. All right. Fourth blemish is discoloration. Maybe you've dealt with this. Maybe you haven't. But if you've ever poured your candle and then come back a few days later, a week later, whatever it is, and you look at it and you're like, I don't remember that brown spot being there. What the heck is going on? More often than not, the culprit for that is vanillin. Not vanilla, vanillin. What is vanillin? Well, vanillin is kind of this market substitute for vanilla because, without getting into it, vanilla is super, super expensive. Like to harvest and grow and create enough to create an extract, it's insanely difficult because it can only grow in a certain part of the world. Then it takes a lot of manual labor to collect those plants. And so the industry said, well, shoot, we can synthesize something that acts just like vanilla. And in their creative spirit, they're like, we'll call it vanillin. So it's a little misleading if you've never seen it. It's not a typo. Vanillin is a real thing. But vanillin is the villain. And the reason is vanillin, like vanilla, will oxidize, meaning if it receives UV light and if it's in your fragrance oil, it will discolor. That's how it reacts to that oxidation. It is just cosmetic. It's not going to affect your performance. You'll still get the same scent throw. But it's really undesirable to have these random spots that look like rust on your candle. Now, I don't know if you guys have struggled with that or seen that or dealt with that in any way, but that's usually what's going on. Well, vanillin is in a lot of different fragrance oils. It's not in the wax, it's in the fragrance oils. And the reason is it does two things really well. One, it's a fixative, so it keeps those top notes that want to evaporate so quickly, it keeps them in. It's like, hey, stay with me. Vanillin's like just this big, group hug with all the notes. It makes your fragrance last longer. So chemists really like using it as a fixative in their blends. The other thing it does really well is it mixes. It just blends really well. Vanilla is this great fragrance that even if it's not a vanilla-based scent, it does a great job. It behaves with a lot of other smells. Whereas some are overpowering, some don't. Vanilla is a good friend. Now, vanilla by itself is pretty good too. I guess I would say I like it. But it oxidizes. That's the problem. So if you have a fragrance oil, and most suppliers, you'll see, they'll call out, this has vanillin in it, and it has this much in it. The higher the vanillin content, the more likely that you'll see discoloration if the candle is exposed to UV light for too long or for too many times or whatever it is. There are a couple things you can do. First is to limit the amount of vanillin that you use. Now, should you do that? Maybe. I don't know. If you're having real problems, then yeah, you should probably swap and go to a different place. The other thing you can do is store your candles out of direct sunlight with the lids on. As much as you can prevent UV light from hitting it, you wouldn't have to fight it as much. The other thing is use containers that are dark or like solid walled, right? That'll protect against UV pretty well, and you won't see it as much. A lot of these scents that you buy from the big box stores is, their containers are not, they're solid, right? You can't see through them, and who knows what we'd see if we could, because they're probably using a lot of stuff like that. You can even see in rare cases that it will oxidize underneath fluorescent lights in a store. So I don't know I've never worked in a retail store like that where we sold candles. I worked at Home Depot, if that counts. No candles there. But you could see even in extreme cases that they can oxidize there too. So lids on, good thing. Solid walls, good thing. Now this is like, most people, I don't want to say most people, I don't think this is as common as I'm probably making it sound, but if you struggle with it and you're scratching your head, this is where I would start with my research or with my suspicions, whatever else it is. But if it happens to you, if you get this discoloration, don't freak out. It's just cosmetic. The candle's fine. It's not going to hurt anybody. It just looks horrible. Okay, last blemish to cover today, most popular one. We've probably all seen it. If you made at least one soy wax candle, you've seen it. This one looks like a smiley face, and that is frosting. Smiley face with no eyes, I suppose. Frosting primarily occurs in soy wax, and it is caused by soy wax, the same thing that we talked about that whole time, all those white crystals, that's frosting. It's just what soy wax does. It's probably the first thing any serious candle maker Googles. What is the white stuff on my candle? Why is my candle doing this? What did I do wrong? You didn't do anything wrong. Literally, I've got a bunch of soy wax candles over there. Room's too messy to show you right now. But every single one of them is over a month old, and they all have frosting on it. Every single one. Now, this one's very old. This was poured in early 2020. I just held on to it. It's kind of one of my long-term candle experiments. But you can see how degraded it is. Now, if I burn it, outside of the wax being older, it's not going to affect it in any way. But what causes it is what we talked about, I think, a little in the course. Maybe we skipped over those lessons. That's okay. But is those crystals appear with two things. First, drastic changes in temperature. So if it sits in a room that cooks and then cools, cooks, cools, cooks, cools, that's going to accelerate this. And the other thing is just the passage of time. As time passes, soy wax does this. And there's nothing you can do about it. And that's okay. Most people buying candles are probably not going to notice it. Not a big deal. I mean, they would notice. This is a pretty extreme case, but, I guess I won't speak for everybody, but most people don't care as much as we do, kind of like with wet spots. But I have 4 things that I stick to doing, things that are both preventative and corrective in nature to deal with frosting. Most of them are preventative, or to a degree preventative, because you can't prevent it. The first is make sure you cure your candle in a stable environment. Try to limit those fluctuations in temperature. This helps with wet spots. This helps with the craters. This helps with frosting. The second thing is be consistent in your build process. You may find certain activities you do make it worse for frosting. So if maybe you poured a really high temperature and every single candle has frosting, think about it. Maybe try something else. Maybe try doing something different. It's the wax. It's not the fragrance oil, it's the wax. The third thing, and these are my 2 kind of more cheeky examples. The first thing is to use a dark container, like pour into an amber container or pour into a solid walled container, like use that. No one will ever see it. The alternative is this is soy wax. You can't see any frosting on this guy unless you look really close. But I'm not going to let you see that close. Undyed wax, you won't see it quite as much. And then the last thing is and this is like kind of cheating, but either switch your wax entirely, use paraffin or beeswax or something else, or just cut your wax. Like blend your soy wax with a paraffin or with a coconut or something like that to see how well it fares in those conditions. Now, most of the time, I wouldn't say you have to worry about it all that much, unless your inventory isn't turning over but once every 6 months. It's probably not going to be too much of a problem, but that's what it is. You can't do anything about it. That's all I know. So it's cosmetic. It won't affect your performance, but that's kind of what I have. So that's all I have. Those are my 5 blemishes. Let me recap real quick. Wet spots, bumpy tops, surface cracks, discoloration, and frosting.